and welcome. Today we're going to have a very interesting conversation on a wide variety of subjects, none of which Bill Wright is comfortable with, but we're going to dig in no matter where we can. Today we have Maggie Miller from The Hill, a cybersecurity reporter, Bill Wright, who is above all things the most incredible human being in the world around government affairs here at Splunk, and myself, Ryan Kovar, distinguished security strategist and leader of Surge, all of which you probably already got from the introductory slide. Our goal today is really to discuss a lot of things around cybersecurity policy, Splunk, and just the general state of affairs in Washington, which is why we brought in the wonderful Maggie Miller. And we wanted to kick off, Maggie, in a pre-brief, we actually went over a couple interesting things that were breaking news or fairly breaking news in the world of reporting and alerts for the national government. Could you go over a quick overview of what that is?
Yeah, for sure. So thank you so much for having me. Great to be chatting with both of you guys today. And, I think the issue that you're referring to is there was a new draft of compromise legislation for the annual defense bill that got dropped. And what I'm seeing, at least on a first glance through, is that cyber incident reporting does not seem to be present in this bill, at least at this time. This is very new, don't know necessarily the details around this. It's certainly surprising, given that this has been an issue that has had strong bipartisan backing in the House and Senate, basically for most of the past year. It's been touted by industry and government officials alike as a way to kind of get a handle on the massive increase in ransomware attacks and other types of attacks in the last year. So, we'll see where that goes. I would be very surprised if the bill that is eventually signed into law by President Biden, the annual defense bill, does not include something on this, but it is very interesting that this initial compromise package seems to have left this out. So, stay tuned.
So, Maggie, for that bill, who's impacted by that? Is that just federal organizations? Is that private organizations, private industry? Who's going to be impacted by these changes?
So, depending on the wording, it's certainly critical infrastructure and/or those doing business with the government. So, a wide swath. I'm also surprised that it has fallen out of the NDA, but I had heard something similar. So I think Maggie's sources are quite good, as always. But yeah, it would have broad impact on anyone doing business with the government and critical infrastructure. It could have come down to maybe some bickering around the timing of when to report a potential incident. I know there was some language of whether that should be 72 hours, whether that should be 24 hours, or somewhere in the middle. Those are one of the sticking points that they're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know, Maggie, previously we had talked about this, and there's a lot of discussion around the actual when you report or how. Have you seen any changes in legislation over the last couple weeks or months? I know there's been a huge slew of bills coming through in Congress around just reporting and how the government's going to react, especially coming up to the 1-year anniversary of SolarWinds. Have you seen anything around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Bill alluded to, there has been some, I think bickering is a good word for it, around the exact language in these bills. There's been a lot of support in the Senate for the idea of a 24-hour notification after a major cyber incident is experienced by a federal agency, a federal contractor, or critical infrastructure owners and operators. I say critical infrastructure, I mean operators like those that operate, the power grid, or, issues like pipelines. We saw like Colonial Pipeline would be subject to this. But then over in the House, they have support more for a 72-hour timeline for that reporting. And industry is much more on the side of the 72-hour, mostly because at least they're saying that 24 hours is far too short of a time to kind of evaluate, first of all, what's going on, and then see if it rises to the threshold of reporting. And I'll also be able to get that information in. There's also been language in some of these bills around the reporting of ransomware incidents. Specifically, if you just suffer a ransomware attack, getting that information into the federal government within 24 hours. There's been conversations around, which organizations, the size of them that might be impacted. So, in the Senate, there was some robust debate over, if an organization has over 500 people, they have to report, and maybe, less, they don't have to. So I think bickering is a good word for it. There's been a lot of discussion around the details, but as I said, it's a very bipartisan initiative to have some sort of cyber incident reporting. So again, I'm quite surprised by this if this does end up getting left out.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of the slack-jawed yokel on this call in terms of policy and what's going through in the politics side. From a previous incident responder, someone who worked extensively in the federal government, I always had issues with specific times being guaranteed because I never know exactly when an incident has started and to the point of when you're reporting it. When I was a SOC lead or working on a hunting team and you have to report upwards to the CISO, then the CISO will come down to you and say, okay, I need you to verify this before I tell the CEO and the board. So I'm curious in the terms of the language, and Bill, I know you were working in the federal government and have been exposed to this. Have you ever seen anything come up that really defines that? When I think of the actual impact on practitioners, I think weirdly enough that clock counting is going to be the debatable thing, because when do you declare an incident? I mean, this has always been an issue.
Not only that, when do you declare, what is an incident, and how sure do you have to be of that incident? I think the language that dropped out of the NDAA was around reasonably certain of an incident. So, layers and layers of ambiguity. I can tell you the legislators and lawmakers have a really tough time trying to define these types of things. I know they've pulled private sector in for consultation, and I think that's what you're seeing a little bit in the slippage and around some of the debates that are going into the word around semantics about reasonably certain of the incident that you alluded to.
Right. We there's one word that we've been saying here quite a bit in this administration and Biden, and there's just seems to me as an outsider a number of attention to cybersecurity in the last year. Probably this little thing, SolarWinds, helped, but it seems like the eyes of government have really focused on this. What have you seen, Maggie, for the Biden administration changing the role of cybersecurity basically in the world? I mean, where the U.S. federal government goes, go with the private sector, go with the world. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're correct in citing the SolarWinds incident because, I think, the SolarWinds incident was discovered while President Trump was still in office, but the Biden administration really had to hit the ground running from day one on cybersecurity, given that at the time they came into office, federal agencies were still digging through their networks, trying to figure out, how far in these, malicious actors had gotten, how long they'd been there, what they'd taken, what they'd seen. So, and then of course you have that followed up by the Microsoft Exchange server vulnerabilities. And then in May, we saw the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident, the JBS ransomware incident, Kaseya in July. It really has just been this ongoing list of attacks that has really forced the Biden administration to put a lot of focus on it. And, to their credit, they really have. We've seen President Biden bring in Chris Inglis to serve as the nation's first White House National Cyber Director. He will have eventually a team of 75 working under him around this issue. You have Ann Neuberger being brought in to serve on the National Security Council. You have Jen Easterly now being confirmed, for several months ago, over to serve as director at CISA. So he has a really good team lined up. We saw President Biden sign the executive order in May around strengthening federal cybersecurity. So there have been a lot of steps and a lot of efforts to try to focus in on this issue of cybersecurity to strengthen the nation's defenses. But I will say, I don't really think the new administration had any choice on the matter. It was just such a do or die moment.
It's interesting to me because when I was working in the federal government, I remember when the executive order for insider threat came through, and there was a huge deal, but it didn't come with very much funding at all to accomplish a mammoth task. And Bill, I know you've worked a lot with this, with our customers, you've talked to folks, are there a lot of challenges around the funding and the resources to actually accomplish any of these new executive orders or legislation coming through for private sector or public?
Yeah, absolutely. I think many of the agency heads, while they wouldn't say it out loud, I think they view a lot of the mandates coming down in the EO as unfunded mandates. Earlier this week, OMB warned about the adverse effects of what a year-long CR would do, and they specifically referenced cyber spend. I think there's broad recognition that a continuing current funding levels of a CR wouldn't provide the funding we need to respond to SolarWinds and respond to the EO. So further budget delays create sort of an exigent risk to be able to respond to future cyber attacks. So we hear that a lot around on the funding and resource challenges. Really complicates the implementation of the executive order.
And Maggie, from your point of view of following the Hill, working at the Hill, what a good name for a company, by the way.
Yes.
Are you seeing that brought up as it's very easy for people to lay down these governmental edicts, but if they don't put the money behind it, they're just going to have more edicts with more compromises? Is this acknowledged? Is this part of it, or are we just getting lost in partisan bickering?
Oh no, that's absolutely being brought up. I think I've seen, especially this year, not to say that there wasn't support for CISA before this year, but there has been a huge amount of talk on Capitol Hill about funneling quite a bit more financial resources into CISA, for example, to give them the ability to carry out a lot of these new mandates that have been put into law for what they're required to do. Another good example, I was just discussing Chris Inglis, the new White House National Security Director. When he was confirmed into office, he actually didn't have any budget for that 75-member staff, and was working out of a different office, and that just went through, I believe, in the package signed into law by President Biden. But that was a really good example of, we had this national cyber director doing what he could for several months, but not having any money to do it. So I think, especially with all of these ongoing attacks, there is certainly a fire lit under Congress to try to funnel some of these funds through, because money is what is needed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Bill, when I think about this and all the different laws coming through, or regulations, and executive orders, is there something that you feel that is missing so far? I know we didn't talk about this before, but I'm just kind of working through this. There's so much, but what are we missing, or what could be done?
No, it's a great question, Ryan. And just to give you a little bit of scope, of course, you have the executive order. You have a number of mandates related to cybersecurity coming out of this administration. You then look to the lawmakers, and our friends at CSIS just compiled a list of, I think there's 157 pieces of legislation right now that in some way reference cybersecurity. So I think that they've got the waterfront covered as far as legislation goes. I would say an area that may need some work is around the skills gap. I think that's something that we're probably going to, the government is going to face even more acutely than we find here in the private sector. So competing for those people like yourself, Ryan, is much tougher in the government. And I think that's only going to continue to grow. So I think that's why you also see a lot of agencies beginning to explore the use of automation to try to take away some of those low-level tasks and really focus their cybersecurity experts on those sort of higher-end threats.
Yeah, I'll be honest. If President Biden, if you're watching, if the cyber czar role is still open, SES, I'm willing to take a sabbatical. Call me. Call me. I got some people over there. Maggie, do you feel like this is being driven from, I guess, when I look at this, is this from the public? Is the public driving these bills, or is this really DC looking inward and saying this is what we need to do to protect our country, or is it just general outrage from the public? Third or fourth after vaccines and voter fraud. But I mean, when we start going down that list, is this groundswell or is this top down?
I would say before maybe even May, it probably still would have been the federal government. I think SolarWinds was a major wake up for the federal government and the country, but I don't think it was an issue that quite as much registered with Americans as the Colonial Pipeline incident did. I mean, I have seen just in my own personal life so much more interest in the issue of cybersecurity and concern about the issue of cybersecurity since Colonial Pipeline, because that was hitting Americans, in their day-to-day lives. If you were living in an East Coast
my father-in-law called me and yelled at me for not protecting America because of that cost. So,
wow.
Yeah, no, personally on my shoulders. So if anyone's looking for someone to blame, Bill Wright. That's the person.
Absolutely. It's all your fault for sure. And put that out in the world. No, but I think that there has been a huge amount of groundswell since the Colonial Pipeline, in that it really was a wake up. The Colonial Pipeline incident, it really was a wake up call for a lot of Americans. And you've really seen that communicated on Capitol Hill, because I have seen members of Congress, come out of the woodwork who, may have had some passing interest in cybersecurity. And all of a sudden there's these new people introducing legislation, really grilling in witnesses in different hearings, every committee, it seems like, holding a cybersecurity related hearing. So there's definitely interest. I think SolarWinds was the wake up for the federal government. I think Colonial was the wake up for the country, and a wake up that was needed, I think.
Yeah.
Bill, what do you think the chance was that somebody had to go look up and find out TSA was responsible for pipelines? Like, I'll be honest, when they're like, TSA is putting out those regulations, I'm like, I feel like somebody just got a giant book and was like, Oh crap! We put that where? Oh man, nothing against TSA doing
Yeah,
wonderful work.
I
But
think I did a similar, similar Googling there. I couldn't agree with Maggie more. The number, when I was on the Hill and his GAC many years ago, the pockets of even cyber expertise were quite small. Maybe one or two members, really understood it. SolarWinds, I think, has created a sea change. Pound for pound, SolarWinds was probably the biggest, and ultimately will have the biggest impact. But Colonial Pipeline really, I think, tapped into sort of the collective fears of the nation. What could potentially happen with a cyber attack and potential kinetic results, and that also then translates into what you're going to hear from your lawmakers. And I think we've seen a slew of critical infrastructure focused bills and discussions out of the administration to try to protect against Colonial and Oldmar and those types of attacks.
And a side note on TSA before you ask, when I first wrote about the new TSA security guidelines, my editor reached out and said, "Are you sure you meant to write TSA?"
that's hilarious.
So
you're
not wrong in that.
I feel so bad for the one or two people who are probably in this like buried office somewhere in like Ashburn, Virginia, at a TSA building, who are like, no, that's us, that's us. We rewrote that.
Yeah.
We see you, TSA. Do you feel, Maggie, from your exposure of following cybersecurity issues, how much of an overlap is there between the recent, discussions around privacy and security with organizations like Meta and now SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline? It does feel like we're just at a tipping point of activity around cyber in ways that I've never seen before. Are they all related?
I mean, obviously Meta is, separate from, the Colonial Pipeline incident. However, I think as there is more public awareness of cyber threats, of course, there's going to be more action taken by the private sector to do more around this. But it's not only being fueled by the public, it's being fueled by the fact that, these bad actors, as we sort of categorically refer to them, but that could be nation states, cyber criminals, a whole host of groups, they really stepped up their efforts during the COVID-19 pandemic in particular. We've seen a huge movement of people around the world online for everything under the sun, from taking classes to attending meetings to going to work. I mean, there's just such a larger, ability to target. And also, as we've seen more divisions pop up around the pandemic and other issues, there's been an easier way to target people who are, online and more susceptible to that. So a lot more phishing, a lot more disinformation potential. So I think you're seeing this growth not only because of public interest, but because out of need, quite frankly.
Yeah. And let me just jump onto that, Ryan. Maggie makes a great point there. The government itself has been going through a digital transformation even before the pandemic. The pandemic absolutely accelerated that. Then throw on a couple of high-profile attacks, such as SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange, and I think you have this confluence of attention on how we're going to transform our government into having more modern IT, more modern cybersecurity practices.
So, broad question: can policy actually change the future for cybersecurity? Maggie, are we going to be able to do this? If we put down these regulations, are we going to see a change in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, or are we fighting uphill and trying to cut water in half?
Well, I think unfortunately, when it comes to cybersecurity, we're always fighting uphill. It's like, a whack-a-mole. There's always, you whack one thing, something pops up. But I do think that there is so much more in terms of policy that can be done in this space. For example, the issue of cyber incident reporting. The federal government has argued that if they know about these attacks occurring in certain industries, then they can warn other industries and they can be on guard and potentially prevent the next Colonial Pipeline attack. So I think that there could be value in seeing this. Another issue that was in the infrastructure bill was the inclusion of, $1 billion in funding for state and local governments, which have been basically starved of funds, especially during the pandemic, for cybersecurity issues. So that could really help on, really an individual level in state and local areas and heighten security there. So I think there definitely is value to policy. I think, you have to see that from the government in order to also spur industry sometimes. So, we'll see in terms of timeline of them having any impact. It varies. And as we know with the federal government, things move at the speed of a snail. So we'll see.
And Ryan, if there's one truism in Washington, it's that technology is always going to outpace policy. I think the best that we can do, with the technology and cyber threat landscape evolving so quickly, the best that we can do is sort of put in common sense policies that are maybe a little bit more flexible, a little bit less rigid, and hope that we can kind of keep up with things.
So I guess I'll go further out. I actually do fundamentally believe that the only way we can solve a lot of cybersecurity problems is through government policy and regulation, which is fairly unusual for me to say. But part of it is I look at SolarWinds and software supply chain, which is a bit of research my team has been digging into significantly over the last year. One of my guys, Marcus LaFerrera, wrote a white paper on defending for software supply chain attacks. And as we kind of went through, it felt like all the tactical things we were doing was just putting fingers in, various land earth dams here. And it wasn't really making a difference. But there's a podcast with, the risky business guys, Patrick Gray, and he brought up this idea, basically going over the Walmart methodology, right? Like no one had barcodes until Walmart, the largest purchaser of everything at the time, said, if you don't have barcodes, we're not buying, right? I feel like the government, being arguably the largest purchaser of software in the world, if they suddenly put in stricter controls of software supply chains, they could make a fundamental change to the entire world. Now, we could argue whether or not it'd be positive or negative, but they would make a change. And just things like having that third-party audit review of code, things like that could be a huge game changer. Have you seen any ideas around that going through the Hill, Maggie, or any sort of discussion around policy for that?
Well, I think in terms of some of what you were touching on, I think you can look at the executive order signed into law by President Biden in May. I think one of the major issues that could spur change, at least in software supply chain, is the fact that any federal contractors have to meet a baseline cybersecurity standard, which immediately closes off quite a few avenues that malicious actors could use to target the federal government. So I think, and quite a few other issues included in the executive order, I think could be, of help on that. And there's certainly different bills on Capitol Hill that would address that. But yeah, I actually agree with you. I think policy is incredibly important in this space, and incredibly important to show for the federal government to take a strong stance on this, and a bipartisan stance, which I think is also extremely key and is currently what is in place. So
yeah, it's interesting, in that executive order, not only is it that the government using their purchasing power to protect the government and the agencies, for instance, the secure software development, but no company is going to make the decision to implement secure software practices for the government and not elsewhere. So in some ways, you are also improving the overall security of the software, not just in there for the government.
I can certainly say if I had a real job again, I would pretty much only buy, if something like this went through and the government said, yes, this is one of our vendors because they've been through our stringent control process. I don't think I could get a purchase through my CISO if I hadn't purchased through that same company, right? Like because it's like the Gartner Magic Quadrant, right? Like I didn't care where you were in the Magic Quadrant. I just wasn't even allowed to put a purchase order through unless you were up there. I think this is something that we could see an actual change affected for people. Which would be fascinating. I do go back to the threat sharing, which has been another huge part of the Biden administration executive orders, along with the alerting, and the two go hand in hand. And at a former organization I worked at, my colleague and I put in a rule where we had an incident, and it was on a weekend, and it was a junior SOC analyst. He saw something bad. It was a watering hole attack. For those of you not familiar with the watering hole attack, it means a legitimate website has been compromised in some way and it's distributing malware or a variety of different things, but it's doing naughtiness. And the problem was he knew that this website, which was a top 100 website, was beloved by the executive management in the company. And if he blocked that, he was going to get yelled at significantly. So instead of blocking it, he waited until someone more senior picked up their phone 7 hours later, at which point we blocked it. And the reason he did that is he was terrified of being yelled at and getting in trouble for blocking. It's not CNN.com, but we'll say CNN.com. I can see the same sort of issue happening for organizations. Like I would be terrified of now reporting upwards because when that clock starts ticking, that's going to be a thing. And like what you don't want to be is the company that reports erroneously, but now you're in the news because it has to be reported, and FOIA and all sorts of stuff like that. From a personal point of view, I love the idea, but from a practicality point of view, I can see some issues. Bill, I know you've been around the block from a working of the policy point of view in different agencies. Can you see this impacting that adoption at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want strong public-private partnerships, and in fact, if this administration deserves kudos for one thing, it's going to be around their push for strong public-private partnerships. The JCDC, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, was launched under Jen Easterly immediately. Had 130 companies there and ready to participate. Traditionally very secretive agency, an NSA, very publicly has the cybersecurity, the CCC, Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, I believe. So there's really a huge effort around public-private partnership. I think it's the right direction. I think you want to incentivize companies to share. But at the end of the day, Ryan, I think that companies have been sharing. This is nothing new. I think everyone wants to do the right thing. And I think the government needs to make space, like the JCDC and other mechanisms, to share information without the fear of getting sued or anything like that.
Yeah, I personally can't give more praise out to CISA and Jen and JCDC for the outreach. They're doing phenomenal work, and feels like every time I get on Twitter, I see another photo of Jen just being awesome somewhere in the world at a conference. So very happy to see that very public support of the government and also the private-public relationships.
Yeah.
What are some things that you're seeing, Maggie, maybe a little bit more broadly, but being sponsored or that have support around helping these federal agencies with their cybersecurity hygiene, kind of going through that background? Like, are you seeing bills? Are you seeing discussions in your meetings where people are talking about more fundamentally ways to improve that aren't legislation, but will kind of help holistically across the entire world?
Well, I mean, I think if you're talking about Congress, kind of the way they do address it is with legislation or with hearings. And certainly cybersecurity hygiene at federal agencies has been a constant topic of conversation this year following the SolarWinds hack, which, of course, as we know, they were able to access, the hackers were able to access at least 9 federal agencies without detection for most of last year. So it's definitely been an issue to bring up. I know the Government Accountability Office has put out several reports this year talking about the need to address cybersecurity federal agencies. In fact, it was one of the high risk issues put out in a report earlier this year. And GAO actually was quoted with saying in the report that cybersecurity at the federal level had regressed since 2019. So there's certainly interest in needing to improve federal hygiene. Just a variety of bills that would address enhancing cybersecurity at federal agencies at the federal level through various efforts. I think we'll see a lot, regardless of cyber incident reporting, the National Defense Authorization Act is always a big channel for pushing through a lot of cybersecurity legislation. Last year, we had over 24 major initiatives from the Cybersecurity Solarium Commission that were included. So I will see what happens with the NDAA, but there's certainly been interest in Capitol Hill on improving cybersecurity at agencies because honestly, SolarWinds was not only a national security issue, it was pretty embarrassing.
Yeah. Yeah, my former alumni of Homeland Security, Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee issued a report, I think in September, giving grades to I think 9 or 10 different agencies on their cybersecurity. I'm not sure anyone got above a C. Perhaps I have to go back and check that out. So Congress is certainly using their oversight powers to put pressure on agencies to get better. I would say they need to take the next step, and that is provide the resources and funding to get those agencies where they need to go. I mean, they've been asked to, for instance, implement zero trust architecture. I don't know too much about this, but I know that it is a fundamental shift away from the sort of castle and moat strategy. It takes the focus a little off the firewall and perimeter, and has agencies sort of looking inward for any movement. And I know that the administration's looking at this as the primary means to ensure defense against supply chain attacks like SolarWinds. kind of begs the question, could you have had a SolarWinds if agencies were implementing this zero trust approach? There may be some conflicting opinions on that, but I think most would say no, but perhaps it would have been detected earlier.
It's fascinating going through SolarWinds, and I was part of the lead response for SolarWinds here at Splunk, where we talked to a lot of customers, and I think I talked to over 170, 190 plus customers globally, mostly federal, and the majority of customers said, "Oh, could you have detected SolarWinds with your software?" And sadly, I had to say no. We could not have detected the initial ingress of the novel attack methodology used by the adversary into the SolarWinds software supply chain, but almost every customer I talked to had the tools available to actually detect it once it was in their network using traditional network defense. It's not an impossible task. They were using lateral movement. They had persistence. They had to scan the networks. They were doing all the things that APTs, advanced persistent threat actors, have been doing for 20 years once they got into the network. The way they got in was incredible, but the actual everything afterwards you could have caught with normal everyday tools if you were looking at the right places. And zero trust absolutely would have helped reduce the scope of infection after they got in. So it was fascinating to see that put in. For those of you who've never looked in zero trust, it's a really interesting thing that's really gotten the attention of vendors and customers in the last 2 years. But Google was doing this with something called Beyond Core, I think in 2012, 2013 or so. They wrote the first white paper, maybe even earlier, 2011. Highly recommend reading it if you've ever want to dig into the background there. It's really good, solid, just basic, incredibly hard to deliver upon security fundamentals. Which kind of brings me to the next stage. We've been talking a lot about today and yesterday, but I'd love to talk a little bit about the future of cybersecurity in the federal space. So, Maggie, if you were writing bills, right? If you were allowed to, if you could just give one, put it on the steps of the Capitol building and walk away and be like, yes, discuss. What would you do? What would you put through? What's there's something came to your mind immediately. It was probably crazy, but where would you start waving your magic wand?
Oh my goodness, that's such a big issue. And I want to have a disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer. I don't write bills, and I am certainly not involved in drafting these bills for anyone that thinks I have that sort of position. I guess one of the things that comes to mind is simply, finding a way to address some of the most egregious attacks out there. And I think that especially during COVID-19, I think one issue that has consistently broken my heart has been the consistent targeting of hospitals and healthcare organizations during the pandemic, and other, groups that are similarly important, that are also easy targets, likely to pay up, likely to give in. I don't necessarily, I report on this. I'm not necessarily the cybersecurity expert, telling people exactly how to solve this issue. But, I think there needs to be a little more attention by Congress given to the underdogs, given to the groups that are not just, your day-to-day, private organization, but given to the companies like hospitals, where if they have a ransomware attack, someone could die because doctors don't, they can't access their file, or, a ambulance has to be turned away because they can't take more patients. So, that would be an issue I'd want to address. Gosh, though, that is a big,
I can say that Bill has said personally, and you can quote me on this, Maggie, that he supports kinetic strikes against ransomware operators.
I think that, well, in terms of kinetic strikes, we haven't seen that as much, but I think the U.S. Government, I think General Nakasone acknowledged it this weekend, has been striking back at some of these groups, some of these hackers, which I think is more than warranted. If you're hitting a hospital, if you're hitting, a grid, if you're hitting, a colonial pipeline, there are consequences, and you should.
It's what people always, the books have been written about this. It's something we've obviously talked about conferences of when is cyber warfare turning into something else. And I think the targeting of hospitals, of something that everyone can universally say should be off limits, is one of those, lines in the sand. It'll be interesting to see as, countries progress what that goes through. Bill, you live in DC. What are your thoughts? What would you drop off at the Capitol building?
I'm glad you asked me this question. And also a disclaimer: I am a lawyer, but I was not a good lawyer, which is why I'm doing government affairs work.
I didn't know that. This explains so much about your advice you give me. Thank you.
I try not to publicize. If I could wave a magic wand, I think I would do this in layers. But I think getting agencies and getting everyone sort of back to the basics. I mean, there's so many things they could do to stop 90% of these attacks. So, multi-factor authentication, reliable asset inventories, ubiquitous encryption, your good vulnerability patching protocols, just your basic cyber hygiene would go such a long way. And I learned that from Ryan, actually. So, that would really kind of move things along. And then as you get a little maybe more advanced, I would very much like to see this administration continue this big push on public-private partnerships. I think it's absolute key to success. This whole of nation approach, I think, is the only way we're going to stay ahead of the adversaries. Maggie, you mentioned something just prior to us starting off today about Google and Microsoft using the U.S. court system to go against adversaries. I mean, I think that's something this administration probably looks well upon. They're really looking for all the tools in the in the national tool chest. Continued investments, especially in the sort of infrastructure side, as Maggie said, money to those state and locals that have been hit so hard by ransomware and others, and then money to SLED and continued implementation of zero trust across the agency. So just a couple of small things, Ryan.
And actually, just to add on to my answer, now that my wheels are turning on this,
I sprung this on both of you, but I was inspired. I had brilliant minds on, and we have an hour, so let's go crazy.
Why not? Is the issue of, and not to say that this isn't already in the works, but really investing in cybersecurity education, pushing out money and legislation around maybe K through 12 programs. Not to say that STEM isn't already an issue, but I think cybersecurity issues are some of the biggest national security threats facing this country, and we need to be baking that into education at the from the beginning, and making sure that people and not just and kids and not just women or men, everyone feels like they have a space in this potential workforce coming up, that everyone has the ability to participate in defending the country against these threats. And I think, having that in the K through 12 schools, and then also at the university level, and funneling more towards that would be, it's incredibly crucial. So
that's it's actually a major passion of mine is cybersecurity education. I do a lot of work with SANS and other places in New to Cyber. And one of the soapboxes I put a lot out is that once you've learned the basics of computing, which takes 2 to 3 years, you are 2 years away from being a world expert in something. And I say that because, I started doing cybersecurity in 1999. I've done it now for however many years that is, 21 years, give or take 22 years. And of the 22-ish years of computing experience, of the 30 plus years of IT knowledge that I have, if I go back to me trying to get Duke Nukem to work over a modem, 30 years of knowledge, and 5 of them are relevant. 5, right? I have 30 years of wisdom, but no one has asked me to configure a Banyan Vines system or repair and exchange 5.5, which is 1994 technology, for a very long time. And so the wonderful thing about our world, and the terrifying thing, is you're constantly having to learn, which means it's an equal playing field. That I think that people think, oh, you have to be a graybeard wizard. But when I look around at things like Kubernetes, when I look at AWS, these are technologies that can't even legally have a beer yet, right? They're not even allowed to they're not allowed to do anything in the computing world. They're so junior. Anyone can learn this from the ground up. And I think there's an aspect of demystifying this that needs to happen, because a lot of work has been done to create that baseline of education where you can just go become the next Kubernetes expert, become the AWS cloud expert in ways that 20 years ago you would have had to start with C# and C and learn the basics. Now we've kind of elevated. So starting with that education is a huge point. I'm doing a talk at RSA around basically the human pipeline, and that we have an incredible reservoir of talent, but people have a valve. It's the pipeline is ready to come, but people aren't releasing the valve because they have these set expectations of years of experience or preconceived knowledge, where my thought is, you get a smart person in, it's going to take a year for me to train someone up if they already know what they're doing or if they don't. So if you open your aperture a bit, you have a lot of opportunities to bring incredible humans in.
And Ryan, do you feel like the next generation of cyber defenders are going to have a little bit of a head start, being digital natives? Will some of this just become, a little bit more instinctual to them?
Yes and no. I think they're familiar with how to use a keyboard. I had to go to typing classes. Bill, I'm sure you were using an abacus. But I think the digital warriors of today and tomorrow, a lot of times what we see is there's a disconnect between understanding how the things work versus the user interface. And adversaries work one step below. So we do have to teach that. And that's what I mean of I have to teach everyone. And anyway, if you've never done that before, it's a new education suite, but it's not incredibly difficult. And there's a lot of roles that need to happen. But here's the kicker. We need them today. We need them last year. We need them 5 years ago. And we have to build up this pipeline, right? We got to get that data lake. We got to get that lake filled up and then start pushing through this path. And I'm curious, Bill, we've done a lot of work and discussion around automation as a force multiplier. Do you feel like that's a way to kind of cover that gap until we get what we need?
Yeah, absolutely. Automation is going to become key as we run into shortages of skilled technical talent. It also plays a key role in the implementation of zero trust architecture. So we're hearing a lot of that from our federal customers. So federal agencies should be looking at least at security automation, machine learning to enhance those cybersecurity efforts. There's tremendous competition for technical skills, especially in security. It can be very, very difficult to compete with private sector, but through automation, these agencies can have technology do some of that lower level operation security work, and then allow the experienced cybersecurity professionals like Ryan and his team to focus on those sophisticated threats.
And we had a question come in from the audience, and Maggie, I'm going to throw this to you because I've already heard Bill talk about this ad nauseum, and I'm sick of them. If we could magically expand the private and public sector partnerships, I'm really fascinated in your viewpoint as a little bit of an outsider here. You're seeing, we obviously have a vested interest, Bill and I, and we also worked on the public side. But you're sitting outside and you're able to throw stones at all of us. So where do you see? We'll start with where would you expand, and then I'll ask a much more risque question afterwards.
Oh, risque question. Okay. Well, in terms of the public-private partnership, I mean, I think the quote that is always used by federal officials is that 80% of the attack surface is in the private sector. So I think there can only be growth in public-private partnership and only be growth in greater transparency of these attacks. I have to say, just as an American and someone who lives in this country, I think the idea of having greater cybersecurity reporting would be very beneficial because we can see more of these attacks. And I think having that reporting and having that flow of communication between the public and private sector could only be good. I mean, I think a big example of this that's already been enacted was, the election security debate. Following up in 2016 on Russian interference, there was a huge change in how the federal government approached election security. And you've seen so much more coordination on the security side of things in the 2018 midterms, 2020 election as a result of that growth of public-private partnership and that growth of trust, which I think is very key. And CISA gets a lot of kudos in that, and CISA just saying, hey, we're here, we're available, we want to help, and not always being sort of that heavy-handed federal partner that's telling you what to do, more just being a resource to, as I said, 80% of the attack surface. So growth can only be good, in my opinion.
Yeah, and if I just add on to that, completely agree. There's so much more we can be doing around, threat information sharing with each other. I think as that trust builds, as Maggie just said, we can then move public-private partnerships into a more operational realm. And I think that's where we'll really begin to see the benefits. There's huge reservoirs of goodwill on the industry side and on the government side. I've seen it. And that trust is, I think, building probably every day.
So I guess one of the things my team does is we always do a hot wash, and we've forced Bill into this as well. And he's been a very happy participant. But we have a motto on my team of fail less. And the idea being every single day you fail, and your only goal tomorrow is to fail a little bit less. But the only way you learn to not fail is to kind of talk about what those are. So Maggie, once again, independent third party, where are you seeing places that should be improved that haven't done well so far?
Oh, goodness.
I'll go with Maggie, and then Bill, I want to hear yours as well.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I think, as I said, federal agencies are taking a lot of steps right now, especially after SolarWinds. But clearly, as Bill alluded to with the Homeland Security report, there is more that can be done at these federal agencies. I think one issue that they're facing is the workforce shortage. It's true that working in the private sector is a lot more lucrative than working for the federal government, which is unfortunate because sometimes that drives talent away. So I think, as I said, the federal agencies have space to grow there. But I also think, certain sectors, we saw the water supply issue in Oldsmar, Florida earlier this year that really struck terror into my bones because I was like, oh, this is what we've been watching for, which was when a hacker unsuccessfully attempted to poison the water supply for an entire town. And in that case, they just didn't really have the IT professionals as much in place at these smaller groups. So I think you see that as like, maybe the New York City water supply company might have, 30 IT professionals, but what about these smaller towns that provide water to 30,000 people? I think when you're looking at sort of the state and local side of things, there are a lot of vulnerabilities there. And, not just in the water supply, but just in any type of critical infrastructure that's being, driven by only a few employees with the expertise. So I think funneling money to that space can only be, useful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And when you look across society and see where improvements need to be made, it is a target-rich environment. Frankly, I mean, probably every agency could improve. And then you go to the different sectors, as Maggie referenced, and not all sectors are built the same. I think the financial sector is probably doing quite well. And then you go to other sectors, such as water and others, and maybe the basics aren't even there. So in many ways, society is only as strong as their weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. So I think maybe focusing on those sectors that need to come up to a certain level, maybe what we need to do, and then focus on those basic cyber hygiene things we discussed, that may cover 80% of the problems you face.
So let's flip this. We talked a lot from the top down. Let's go the other way, and I'll start with Maggie and go to Bill again. What can corporations and private industry do to force or help along policy discussion? What can we do in the world as Americans, as Splunk, a vendor, as anyone else? What should we be looking at, Maggie, to start pushing through or helping out from that side?
Sure. Well, I think something that's been brought up often to me is the need for boards of different companies to prioritize cybersecurity. I think there has been a move towards that, but we need to see more leadership at companies putting cybersecurity as a top issue. And when I say companies, I don't mean just, an IT or a security company. I mean any organization out there. I mean, nowadays, I think I write 3 or 4 stories a week about different companies that get breached, and they suffer millions, sometimes billions of dollars in losses as a result. So I think making it a priority at the company level, ensuring that there are trainings for employees. I mean, I often tell people that ask me, they're like, what can I do to protect myself? I say, well, 90% of attacks could probably be foiled if you simply changed your password once in a while, didn't click on things, just educate yourself about, how to stay safe online and the key tips of cyber hygiene. So I think just better cybersecurity awareness at the industry level and, better leadership and focus on the issue.
Bill?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And as Maggie said, I think that 10 years ago, the cybersecurity was definitely a second, third hand issue. It has now made it to the boardroom. There's an initiative underway now to have every public board in the U.S. to have someone with cybersecurity background. That just shows you, how much, how far we've come in 10 years and taking it seriously. But I think the number one thing that private industry can do is to just continue to innovate. Most of our innovative technology that is going to help us defend against these advanced attacks is coming from the private sector. And then maybe loosening up the reins on the government side to allow procurement of innovative technology. Right now we're in about a 36-month process for the government to go through all of its purchasing. By
Come on,
that
Bill,
time,
you just have to wait for end of financial year. That lasts 3 weeks. Everything works.
we need a more agile system in government to adopt some of these great technologies coming out of the private sector.
Yeah, well,
All right.
agile and government are not really two words that typically go together. So
I have hope. I have hope.
Mhm.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, and assuming Bill's bosses don't have me fired, I would like to come back next year and discuss what I'm about to talk, which is it's December. We work in cybersecurity. We have to have predictions. Otherwise, we don't get to keep our jobs, right? So let's do a couple predictions. And I'm springing this on both of you, thus Bill's look of absolute wide open-eyed fear. I'll start with Maggie, because you've already probably written this article. So what are your thoughts for the next year? What do you think is going to pop up? And we'll, obviously we're talking wonky things here, but what do you think is going to be wonkerific over the next 12 months or 6 months in 2023 or 2022? What year? I don't even, this COVID, it kills me. 2022, there we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I can't believe it's going to be 2022. And actually, I'm working on this article right now, so I haven't quite written it, but working on it.
Preview.
Yeah, I think, I hate to say it, but I think we're in a world where several very key nation states have discovered that they can hit us where it hurts most in cyberspace. So I hate to say it, but I'm sure we will continue to see different efforts by the big four: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And, they all have different goals. North Korea tends
Only there was an easy word, a phrase to call them. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I live in Dallas. I'll swing by GW and talk to him.
I always think of them as the big four. I guess that's how I refer to them, but that's not, patented or anything. So I think we'll see, what they decide to go after. I would think there might be some slight change in at least Russian-related targeting, given how much pressure the Biden administration is putting on Russia to address this. I think there might be more increase on the China side, because I think we don't have quite as much pressure applied there. So those are just kind of more broad trends. I don't think you can talk about 2022 without talking about the midterm elections and what that means in the cyberspace and the disinformation, misinformation space. I'm hoping we won't see too many more cyber issues around that, but I think we always do. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, the Justice Department put out an indictment against 2 Iranians for trying to interfere in the 2020 elections. And, we're just seeing the details of that now. So we'll find out. I think in terms of misinformation, disinformation, definitely a little worried about that, given the space around that after the 2020 election. So we'll kind of see how the 2020 election bleeds into that, and also we'll see the impact if we do get through any of these cyber reporting bills. I'm really interested to see how that changes the federal space in terms of responding to attacks, how that changes the pace of attacks. If there's a lot of attacks that are able to just I never have to write about them, that'd be great. I can actually.
You don't want to write Kathaya and Black Matter and anything like that ever again? You just.
I will, but every time I do, it just makes me a little sad. Although it's more to write, which is great. But it'd be great if they didn't take place over holiday weekends. Would love that.
We would all like our days back, especially Bill, because I put him on call. We don't even pay for on call. I just say, Bill, you got to cancel. I need legal rep.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think. I hope the pace of attacks slows down in 2022. We don't see quite as many banner headlines about it, but I do think, it's a world where, we're moving online more. There's a larger attack surface. So I think we might see more of the same in some respects.
There we go. Bill, I'm going to give you an option here. We have a lovely question about cybersecurity insurance. So, dealer's choice, predictions for 2022, or we close off with a riveting discussion on cyber insurance and federal policy.
I think I'm gonna go with the original question there on predictions. It was a close one.
All right, let's do it.
So Maggie took a lot of the good ones, and I completely agree.
Bill, I want you to say I completely disagree, and here's why.
No way. I think Maggie.
No way. Not possible. Not possible with Maggie Miller.
She's spot on as always. I think there's going to be a couple of trends continue. I think we are going to continue over the next 2 years to see agencies implement zero trust, because it really is a journey rather than a destination. There's just a lot of work that's going to be going on. I think that over the next 2 years, we're going to see an honest to goodness attack on operational technology, which I think will throw everyone in for a loop and maybe we'll have another sort of SolarWinds inspired policy changes throughout the government and throughout critical infrastructure. And speaking of, I think, and you're already starting to see it, I think there will be continued federal encroachment on cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure. So we saw, some of the light touch stuff around rail a few months ago. I think just last night, some light touch stuff come out about water plants. I think you're going to kind of continue to see those trends ratchet up, especially if we continue to have problems there that present, real public safety concerns. And then lastly, I think, as we referenced a bit ago about Microsoft and Google, I think you're going to see private actions from industry occur much more aggressively going forward. Again, I think this administration really is interested in using all elements of national power, including the judicial system.
Yeah, that's been an increasingly interesting world. One of my friends, Kristen Goodwin, who's a general counsel for cyber over at Microsoft, I know she's been leading a lot of that and just watching that approach very effectively. Although you could also argue that we still have cybersecurity problems, so back and forth. But all right, I have a goal. Both of you have to go like this. We're doing pinky swears. We're coming back in a year. We're going to review these because we have the technology to transcript, and you will be graded. And we'll discuss this next year. So that's a promise. Unbreakable bind via Zoom.
I don't want to add one more. Then we'll still be in a continuing resolution.
We'll still be in a CR. Let's just assume we still have a civilization in a year, and I'll be happy. Right. Frankly, if we could just move past the mask, I'll be pretty happy. So we are at time. I've had a lovely chat. This has been great. I look forward to next year. Maggie, thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your day.
Yeah.
It's just been a blast. And Bill, whatever, you work for us, so you have to do it. I will.
Well, thank you, Maggie. Yes.
Thank you for having me. This has been great. I get to, I'm not usually the one being interviewed, so it's a nice change.
Well, I play one on LinkedIn Live and YouTube. So other than that, I don't have any. To everyone who paid attention and listened throughout the whole thing, I'm sorry. I tried to make Bill as wonderful as possible, but it's a lot of scrubbing. This is all said in love. He's very mean to me, so I try to get back to him whenever I can in public forums. Thank you very much for joining us. For anyone who's interested in this sort of pattern, we do a LinkedIn Live with Coffee Talk with Serge every other week. We have one next Tuesday. We have a question about cybersecurity insurance. We've actually covered that pretty often in that LinkedIn Live segment, so feel free to tune in. Arrest this man. Really enjoy that handle. Otherwise, farewell. Have a great holiday. Everyone be safe. And with that, I'll ask our producer to take us away. Or we can sit here and stare at each other.